Well, this morning, the occupiers at Zuccotti Park were paid a surprise visit by the New York City Fire Department and the NYPD, which conducted a safety inspection of the encampment. Now, as part of that inspection, they went from tent to tent, confiscated all generators, propane and gas tanks, and anything else deemed a fire hazard, effectively pulling the plug on the power of Occupy Wall Street, all with the reported cooperation of the protesters. Now, the surprise move came as New York City braces for a freak snowstorm over the weekend. So is the city attempting to freeze the protesters out? And why are they suddenly allowing the protesters to erect a tent city? Joining me from our studio in New York to discuss it is RT producer Lucy Kafanov. Lucy, thanks for joining us tonight. And so, from what the report said, the protesters were peaceful, they let this happen, but how did it actually all go down? I can't imagine that they were necessarily happy about it.
Yeah, I mean, the way Mayor Bloomberg described it is as if the protesters, personally came to his home handing over their much-needed possessions. No, at approximately 8:30 in the morning, some reports say it was 20 to 30 fire department and police department officers showed up at Zuccotti Park. The fire chief used a bullhorn to essentially ask the protesters to bring forward any generators and sort of items that would be deemed a fire hazard. The protesters didn't do that, and then, as you described, the fire department officials, about 20 of them, along with police in uniform, essentially went tent to tent, searching through people's possessions, and in the end, they ended up confiscating something like 6 generators, about 13 gallons of fuel, including a biodiesel generator and a generator that ran on used cooking oil, which is kind of interesting. So that was it was a bit surprising, but protesters are finding sort of different ways to prepare for the winter because, again, as you mentioned, it is cold today and a snowstorm is coming.
So do the protesters feel like this is all just an attempt to freeze them out? We've heard Mayor Bloomberg say in the past, when he decided that they could stay indefinitely, basically making his own assumptions that once the weather got cold, he thought they would leave. Now it sounds like the weather's getting cold and they're trying to give it an extra little kick to try to make sure they leave.
Well, look, I mean, of course, no one's questioning the idea of keeping the Zuccotti Park occupation safe from fire hazards is a lovely, wonderful initiative, especially in light of the fact that it's gotten bigger. There are tents erected throughout the park, but conveniently, it does also remove a major source of power and heat for the protesters. So, yeah, I mean, most of the people I've talked to think that this is absolutely a backhanded tactic to sort of freeze them out of the park and dampen their motivation to stay there. But they're finding ways to fight back. For example, they had a donation of several solar panels that they're going to be using for power. Some of the protesters I talked to today said that they're getting these stationary bikes where you essentially have to pedal on a stationary bike, little bicycle thing to power up whatever technology you need to use. So they're finding ways to do this, but again, it's not the best time considering that we are expecting snow tomorrow. And I should also add, I mean, these power generators weren't just in the media area or the food area. The medical tent relies on power. So that's, a really critical health issue for the protesters.
All right, now, Lucy, you've been our girl on the ground there at Zuccotti Park. You spent a good couple of weeks and you came back safely to Washington, D.C., but now you're in Zuccotti Park again. So just tell me, in just the 4 days that you were gone, what's changed over there?
Well, I mean, physically, it looks very different, very, very different, especially from the time that you guys were down there. They do have these tents now. I mean, it kind of looks like a, base camp at Mount Everest. Tents are all over. It's a lot harder to get through. The turnout is still pretty big, but again, the weather is getting cold, so you almost have this blanket of gloom across the park. But physically, just the way it's changed was the biggest surprise for me. And I feel it's sort of divided the park to some degrees. I mean, they need the tents in order to survive the winter, to stay in the cold, but at the same time, it sort of changes the atmosphere a bit because things used to be a lot more open. One of the protesters I talked to said that, in the past, sanitation teams, for example, as they're cleaning the park areas, if they saw any sort of riffraff or people doing anything wrong, it was a lot easier to sort of self-police themselves. Now that people have tents to crawl into, it's a little bit harder to manage the issues among protesters on the ground.
Well, so what happened there? Why are they all of a sudden allowed to have tents? Because this has been a very contentious issue. For a while, they were told they were only allowed to have tarps on the ground, no actual tent city. They couldn't occupy the way they wanted to. And why did that suddenly change?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I mean, I was physically there several occasions when police officers went into the park to remove tent structures, including the Sukkot Jewish religious structure, saying that that was against the rules of the park, and it was illegal for them to keep that there. And I've witnessed police officers tearing that down. So it is really surprising. Bloomberg, when asked about this, said that, or one of the police officers, I apologize, when asked about this, said that it's not that they're choosing not to enforce this rule. Brookfield Properties, which owns Zuccotti Park, hasn't asked the city officially to tear down those tents. But at the same time, we've seen police officers randomly enforce certain rules at their will. So it's a bit confusing why they're letting this stay. Maybe who knows? Maybe they're trying to dampen their motivations step by step. Maybe next week they'll come in for a big raid. But I know a lot of the protesters will be holding their fingers crossed for that not to happen, given the weather.
Well, in terms of what's going on around the country, I'm just wondering if that's a motivating factor or if it brings the spirits down for the occupiers at Zuccotti Park. We've seen a lot of arrests this week, from Atlanta to especially Oakland, where we also saw Scott Olson be injured by that tear gas canister. What have the reactions there been like?
Oh, people are furious about this because, remember, this is a very web-connected occupation. They're very much on top of what's going on in other cities and other areas across the country. The beating of Scott Olson, the excessive violence and force used by the Oakland Police Department was very closely monitored here. People were furious about that. And, in fact, it did sort of result in a boost in numbers, which was later dampened by the coming rain and the weather. But we saw even just 2 nights ago, for example, a major protest where one of the activists that I spoke to said that they've spent all of these weeks training people to be nonviolent, to be calmer, to sort of give no reason for the police to crack down. Well, because of these crackdowns in Oakland, they saw a lot of activists who were, a little bit more rowdy than usual, pulling the orange netting out of the hands of the police officers, for example, trying to knock down barricades. So it's sort of, yes, it's energized the movement, but it's almost brought out an unseen rage that we haven't really felt from the protesters before, and that's a dangerous tactic. If I were a police officer, I think these heavy-handed tactics could inspire resentment, anger, and lead to more clashes.
All right, Lucy, I want to thank you so much for filling us in tonight, and hopefully everybody survives the snow out there, and if you're going to be there this weekend too, stay warm. Thanks.
Thank you.